All right, here we go again. Hello, everybody. Yes, it's your good friend Pozzible here, and I got Joe.
Hey, how's it going?
And today we have a very special discussion for you today. One of our favorite subjects, our past shows, the iconic machines of yesteryear. There are a lot of shows that come out. There's a lot of ideas that are being tossed around over and over again. But one thing I find that we don't seem to have as much anymore, like we did when we were growing up, are not just machines, but really important machines. Machines that had character and, they were a driving force all in themselves.
Right.
And these were some of the machines that you just can't have a show if you didn't have these. So we came up with a top 10 list. We kind of argued about the order somewhat.
I was right, he was wrong, but it's his podcast.
Yeah, but we do have some honorable mentions to start off with first. One honorable mention is Street Hawk. Back in the 80s, mega machines were all the rage. And pretty much anything that was a machine was given super, technological advances. Street Hawk was one of them. It didn't take off like the other ones did. I mean, this was a motorcycle. It was controlled by this driver, but he had help from the engineer in this little bunker room, who could manipulate it so that the lights would all be green for him.
Basically. Right, I remember that now.
And he could go at super top speeds, and he could even levitate in probably the lamest levitation you've ever seen in your life.
Yeah, we didn't have a lot of special effects back then.
He was incredibly slow, but you know what? They tried.
Yeah.
And if there's ever a show, what they say, if you're going to do a remake, you should reboot the failures, not the successes.
Yeah.
And so this is a reboot. This is because you can make it really cool, and with modern day technology, you can make it faster, make it better. But Street Hawk, definitely an honorable mention. Next up, Battlestar Galactica: The Vipers. This is what saved humanity. This is what kept us alive when the Cylons were blowing us up on their little, I don't know what are those, pucks? They call spaceships.
Yeah, I don't remember.
What's so funny is that I always loved the fact that there were 3 Cylons for every one of their spaceships. Whereas today, in the modern remake of it, the spaceship itself was a robot. It just didn't have the same feel for it, because at least the Cylons could talk to each other. These were the iconic Vipers, and don't get me wrong, one of these ships, or some kind of spaceship from the Battlestar Galactica, got them in trouble. Now, you have to understand there's been no research in this, but if memory serves, and it normally doesn't, but one of the reasons why Battlestar Galactica, the initial 70 series, went wrong was not just because they had some weird episodes at the end, but because they got sued by George Lucas because they were using his spaceships that he made for Star Wars. But he never used them in Star Wars, but he still owned the rights to those ships. Well, the people, somehow they got the designs, they used them instead, and that's one of the things that happened. But don't quote me on that. Like I said, we haven't studied the story that deeply. We're just mentioning that these ships were awesome. And the human race in Battlestar Galactica wouldn't have gone far without Vipers to battle for them in outer space. Next up, we have the actual list now. And in a very blurry beginning, we've got the A-Team.
That's the best pick you can get.
That's one of the best picks I could get. I mean, I wanted something that really reminded you it was the A-Team. It was their van,
Yeah, you saw the black van with the red stripe, the red spoiler, and you knew you were watching the A-Team.
Exactly. This is how they got around. And what's so funny? I mean, they had this everywhere. If they were in El Salvador or if they were in Russia, no matter where they went, the van was there. Even though one of the things you mentioned, they could really use any vehicle, this was their main vehicle.
Right. I think they decked it out a little bit. I never watched the A-Team that much, but like I said, the van, I will always remember that van.
Right. It's where they, got their mission instructions and everything. You know what really makes this an icon? Back in the day when we had series, everything was as similar as possible. One thing this kind of reminds me of, and if it wasn't such a common car or just so common, I would have mentioned it. In the show Burn Notice, which is an awesome show on USA starring Jeffrey Donovan and Bruce Campbell, he has his own car, which is the Mustang that he drives everywhere. Right, good car. common car. That's the problem. This van is special, decked out and painted in their special way. I couldn't believe they destroyed it. That's the first thing they did in the A-Team movie that they made.
Oh, really?
The first thing they did was they destroyed it. It's like, come on, guys, this is an icon. You don't destroy the icon, you know.
Yeah.
Next up, Echo 1 of the Ghostbusters.
Ecto 1.
Ecto, that's right, Ecto. I always want to say Echo 1. As a matter of fact, I think I typed it in. It's like Echo 1. I don't see it.
Echo 1 was someone who worked on the Hoth base.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Wasn't he the guy who was like Imperial troops?
Yeah, probably.
Imperial troops are in the base.
Yeah, this is Ecto 1.
This is Ecto 1. And you know what? I understand now why you wanted me to put this in front of 18s. We had it swapped before. This was the Ghostbusters' one and only vehicles, and it really defines them. It's still functional, but it is beaten down, and you know what?
It was a hearse that they customized.
Exactly. And the real thing about Ecto 1 that's kind of disappointing also is that look how all the stuff they have on top and all the gears and bells and whistles, and they never used any of it in the movies. They just drove around, and I guess back in the day they could have actually have been too difficult to actually try to do anything with it, but maybe if the sequel ever comes out or if a reboot ever comes out, they can change that.
Well, they'll probably modernize it now.
Exactly.
Put it in a new Ford or something.
Exactly. Next up, we got Knight Rider. You cannot have a list like this and not talk about Knight Rider.
I mean, KITT. Do you remember what KITT stood for?
Oh,
I don't remember.
Knight Industries. Something.
Yeah.
I remember
TT.
TT. That's the funny thing about KITT. It's KITT. What's funny is that Joe tried to find a picture earlier, and all he could get was
kittens.
Kittens. Yeah.
Yeah. I typed in KITT on a search tonight.
But this, to be honest, and I know you're wondering, like, gosh, Pozzible, why is this in the far back end of the list? You'll understand in a moment. But remember, guys, this is what it was all about. The one thing KITT had going for him that was very rare back in the 80s was that little sensor that went back and forth. Everyone wanted that on their car. It was so cool. But KITT could talk. He could drive himself.
It was bulletproof, wasn't it?
It was bulletproof.
They had the turbo
boost, which everyone loved. They had to put that in every.
Yeah, that was like in every episode.
Yeah,
right? At least one thing he's jumping over a barn or something, or a building, a silo, whatever.
All of these things are iconic and memorable, and they all had their own character. But KITT was the hope of the future. You know, everyone wanted a car like that. I remember one time in the early episodes, Michael Knight was driving with KITT, and he was reading a book while KITT was, doing the driving for him, and a cop car got behind him. Now, also, one of the things you gotta remember about KITT is that, he had a digital display.
Yeah,
and that was not. Yeah, I don't think any car had a digital display back in those days. He had lots of displays, lots of push button controls, lots of automatic control, and clearly this was a car that was smarter than the driver.
Yeah.
I mean, I love David Hasselhoff. Don't get me wrong.
Me too.
Great actor. He made Knight Rider, but this car definitely upstaged him because it could do all the stuff that he could not.
Right.
One of the first things they did in the episodes is that KITT got him to the top of a building. He was able to do the famous ejection seat, right? So he shot up Michael, and of course he goes up 3 stories, but he only has to come down 2 feet.
Right.
And that, of course, very well done. We can't say enough about this car.
Yeah, this is just phenomenal representation of the 80s.
And our optimism that we had back then for technology. What we expected our future to be.
Not a big fan of the Trans Am, but this one's actually on my list.
Well, yeah, they did change it. Didn't they also give it like turbo boost? I mean, not turbo, Lamborghini. Was one of the. They changed him up of every. He was the Trans Am. This was the more earlier version.
Yeah.
And just an iconic car. Next up, come on now.
If you don't recognize this car, there's something wrong. Even from the back.
Yeah, the back. This is why I chose it from the back. This is the DeLorean, the time machine, and a flying car. Once again, the technological optimism of the 80s is purely found in this from this trilogy, and even a cartoon.
Yeah,
Back to the Future. They made a video game out of it recently.
It was about a couple of years ago.
Yeah,
I think at this point.
I don't think it did too well.
It started out and it price dropped to like 30 or 20 bucks immediately.
To be honest, if I ever find it, I will buy it,
I wanted to play it too.
I'm just curious, but man, why did it have to be so? Why do they take something you love so much and make it so horrible? We loved Back to the Future. It was funny. It was cute.
Right.
It was the ultimate family movie.
Yeah.
The kids of all ages could watch it, and it wouldn't be anything without this car.
I think the cool thing is you sit down and you watch it with your parents.
Yeah.
As a kid in 1985, when he goes back to 1955, it was like, Mom, was that how 1955 really was? And the parents can get into it because most of the parents of the kids who were kids in 1985 were in the 50s.
Right, they were the teenagers of the 50s.
My parents used to tell me, talk about Back to the Future, and you listen to the music, and it's like, we listened to that music back then.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that's, it was very realistic, very well done, but pure fantasy, pure adventure. Not so much action, not so much violence, but real suspense and just real fun to watch. And of course, this car being a time machine was one thing, but when Doc Brown brought it from the future and into the
cover conversion,
and you know what? That's the one thing. The back of it, if you see the white part there, I'm pointing at it. Mr. Fusion, was that ever? To this day, we still wish we would have that, where we could take our trash, put it in something, and power something.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was, again, awesome. Here's one of my personal favorites, Airwolf.
Yeah, I was never a big Airwolf fan.
I am a huge Airwolf fan. Airwolf is just, the badass helicopter. One of the reasons they call it a wolf is because you get the idea it's a wolf in sheep's clothing. Right now, it's in sheep's clothing. It looks like a regular helicopter. It's a helicopter that can go Mach 1 and can fight anything in a battle. Sometimes I wish if they ever rebooted Airwolf, okay, it would not be start new. It would be actually a sequel. Like somebody finds Airwolf today the way it was back in the 80s, and it would be compared to like what the technology was like back then, with all the wires and push buttons,
right.
And the weird what's that thing called on a computer screen?
The display?
The displays. Well, yeah, the display. Think about what the animation and displays were like back then versus today. And but yeah, I mean, I would hate for them to do a sequel and try to like bring Airwolf to a modern day.
Modernize it and all that.
Well, they did that in a sequel when they came up with the second. They gave it a laser all of a sudden because in the 80s everything had to have a laser all of a sudden. But Airwolf started off being very down to earth. It had guns, it had missiles, and it had something I'm surprised we never developed, which was the oh my gosh, I can't believe it. Sunfire. I'm going to come up with...
Flares?
Yeah, the flares. They were basically flares. I mean, think about it. Well, how do missiles find you? They're heat-seeking missiles, right?
Yeah.
Sunburst.
Yeah.
So they fired off a sunburst, and the missile would catch the sunburst instead and hit the sunburst instead of the airplane. It's a brilliant idea, but they never developed it. Probably wasn't really as realistic as it looks.
Right.
I mean, come on. We have a Airwolf that could go like Mach 1. Helicopters to this day can't even do that with all the technology and all that. But hopefully one day, you never know. That's what these things were really about,
Yeah.
I mean, it's the optimism. It was the hope that in the future we would have these things. And Airwolf hit that beautifully.
Right.
Well acted, too. Great story. Had Ernest Borgnine.
I watched some episodes for Ernest because I used to like him as McHale's Navy.
Yes.
So when I see him now,
he was the hilarious Italian. I mean, he was the comic relief without being stupid. He was fun. He was funny. He was great to watch. Jan Michael Vincent was the Stringfellow Hawk, which was the main hero. He was great in it also. However, he was too dark, too sullen. And I understand that he had a rough life in the story and all that. His real life story is not anything to sneeze at because he can't remember anything from this time period. From all the alcohol and drug abuse he did, his memory's just shot, which is a shame because this was just beautiful show. You wish them all the best, and Ernest Borgnine, what an incredible life he had.
Right.
All right, coming up next, we've got the General Lee.
This one is my personal favorite.
Joe,
I grew up on this show. This was like to this day, I want to own this car. I don't even care if I have to leave the windows down to get in through the window,
Mm-hmm.
It's just, I want this car. I think this car from head to tail is absolutely gorgeous. But this car in particular, General Lee from the Dukes of Hazzard, I mean, the thing could, up until the last season,
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Some of the stuff was really cool with the way they did it. And I mean, this car is like, you see this one driving down the road, you instantly recognize it pretty much. Anybody who grew up in the 80s recognizes this car.
Exactly. And you know what? You've seen DeLoreans, you've seen Trans Ams, but those are just another car. But when you see the General Lee, the orange paint with the number,
yep, and the one, the
you
Confederate
see it.
flag on top.
Yes.
Yes, and it was, like I said, the end season, I really don't like watching. They started using miniatures, so they had the General Lee jumping over houses and barns and stuff.
Oh, right.
And it took a lot of the realism. I mean, granted, jumping over the creek, not too realistic because you're going to break something. The General Lee rarely broke down. It only broke down in key moments. But, yeah, like I said, this is one of my favorite iconic vehicles.
Oh, yes. I mean, this is one of the most iconic. Like I said, it's completely recognizable. Yeah. They took this everywhere. And you know what's so funny? There was always construction in the show.
Hazard County had two things going for it.
Yeah.
There was always construction, and it never rained. There'd be water on the roads, and, and they were all dirt roads. There would be water, there'd be mud, but it never rained. You know, because if it rained, either the interior of the car would get wet, or they couldn't get in and out of the car because they had to roll the windows up.
Exactly.
So they got
What happened to the doors again? Why did they ever explain it?
Yeah, in the first episode of the last season, they explained it. The car they were entering in a race, so Luke welded the doors shut as a safety precaution. They painted it orange because they took it to Cooters. They needed to paint it, and the only color he had that would cover the whole car was orange.
Oh, wow!
And then they gave it the number 1 because they found it. I think they found it in a junkyard. They actually put a big motor in it, like it was seized from some criminals.
Okay.
They got it because the criminals didn't go back and get it or pay the fine or whatever. So the Dukes paid. They got it. Put this big motor in it, and they painted 01 because it went from nothing to being number 1.
You know, it's so funny.
So that's the story.
Yeah. What's funny is that when you think about it, this is the original Fast and Furious right here.
Oh, yeah.
You know, with the ability to, escape the law and be, be outlaws, but quote unquote still be good guys and drive fast and jump their cars.
And another real quick story about this. Remember the horn that it played?
Yes.
The Dixie horn?
Yes.
Did you ever hear the story how they got that?
No.
They were on set, I think, and some guy drove by and he honked his horn. I think he was in an El Camino.
Okay.
He honked his horn. It was a Dixie horn. The guy's like, I want that horn. So they chase the guy down. They catch him. Okay. They give him $200 for the horn out of his car.
Right.
And then, after they did this and they got it put in or whatever, they found that they could buy it in a novelty store for under $5. so they kind of got burned on that one.
So the moral of the story is when you see something exciting, don't rush for it. Yeah, you can get somewhere else.
Yeah.
Now,
shop around.
Now, here's the funny thing about this podcast. And this is something I didn't think we would actually have to do because I forgot about the horn. That was a custom horn, and that was something very rare for back in the day. Okay, what was this? Late 70s, early 80s?
Started, I think the first episode aired in 1979.
Right. So you're looking at a time when all horns were the same. Now, we are approaching, if it hasn't happened already, because I believe I've been seeing it a little bit here and there, okay? People are getting the option to customize their horns when driving around. All right? So instead of a good old-fashioned honk, it's going to be like Homer Simpson when he made the Homer, and he wanted all his horns to play La Cucaracha. Eventually, that's what you're going to hear driving around. It's like, honk, La Cucaracha, La Cucaracha. It's like, oh, hey, thanks, buddy. I wonder, you know what, though? It's going to be like ringtones. Yeah. We're going to have different versions of people, It's like, okay, this person cut me off. Phaser beam. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. Trust me. Mark my words. Unfortunately, see, that's the one thing we're also doing this about. Back in our day, when, in the 80s and, 70s and 80s, when we made these things, they were iconic and they were cool. Now they're just going to appear lame and stupid.
Yeah, everybody's going to want them.
Everyone's going to want them. All right, next up, the Aston Martin. One of the problems we had when making this was, are we doing movies or are we doing TV shows? And we decided to kind of combine them.
Yeah, we're just figuring, let's just do old vehicles. Not just vehicles, machines, vehicles. Well, we wanted to get everything in there.
And this is the thing. This is the iconic thing that you always see. Now, let me tell you why I put this in here and why I put it so soon. When Skyfall was made with Daniel Craig as James Bond, they brought back this Aston Martin. Now, what made me happy was that they didn't bring back this Aston Martin, they brought back that Aston Martin with all the bells and the whistles and the humor that went with it. Like, for example, James Bond and M were driving around. James Bond started to gear the car, and then he popped the top that showed the red button, which had the ejection button in it. And Judy Dench was like, "Go ahead, eject me. See if I care." You know, they're having a little argument there, and he's like, "You're not going to get smart with me." He pulls out the ejector button, and that's what these things had. They had ejector sheets, they had guns, they had missiles, they were bulletproof. You know, they didn't have the turbo boost, which was the only thing they couldn't do, but they were practically indestructible unless, you know, James Bond initiated the self-destruct button. You know, this is what we loved about our time.
Didn't this one also have a cloaking device?
Not until Die Another Day.
Okay, so this was before the cloaking device.
Exactly.
Okay.
And you know, it's so funny. They had they were making fun of one car company that was making something called the Vanquish. Well, they have something called the Vanish. You know, and you know. Like I said, you know, that's the problem. Sometimes if you go too far with the technology, you know, you get lame. There is something about going too far.
Right.
You know? And when it was something like this, with, you know, back in the days of Sean Connery and even Roger Moore, the technology was still down to earth enough where you could believe it and accept it. But then with Die Another Day, they had reached their peak of insanity. You know, because now they had a car which went invisible, and after Die Another Day, they never went back to gadgets. Right. You know, they went back to the basics. They revamped the James Bond series with Daniel Craig being more action oriented, being more just James Bond and not the gadgets. And that's what happens when technology goes too far. You got to keep it grounded in reality. You know, which brings us really to our next one.
Okay, this was the epitome of going out of reality for technology.
You know what? They didn't really go that far. It went very fast. It had a smoke screen. It had an oil slick. But the Batmobile, now we chose this Batmobile. But if there is...
This was a classic. And
yes.
That's what I liked about it.
But remember, I mean, this had turbine engines and...
atomic batteries.
Yeah, and like the James Bond, this has gone over so many incarnations. Now, whether you start with this one, or you go with the Michael Keaton version, or you go with the animated series version. Animated series version
was based on Michael Keaton's.
I just never understood, why did the front of the animated series have to be so long?
Yeah.
And how do you turn with something that long? It's like, what was in there? Was the engine really that big?
Yeah, I don't know.
But, I mean, let's face it. If you want Batman, you gotta have the Batmobile.
Right.
You need this. I mean, this is what Batman's all about. This is how he gets around. This is one reason why I love Batman, because he had this. I mean, Superman could fly around, and a lot of superheroes can fly, right? But Batman, being human, always had his machines. And yes, there was the Batcopter, the Batplane, the Batboat. But what's the one thing he always had?
The Batmobile.
Exactly.
This one, I think it was based off the Pontiac Futura, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
It was like a modified. I think that's the car it was based off of.
Right.
This is probably one of my favorite Batmobiles. Right.
I mean, Batman was known for his gadgets. No matter what the situation was, he always had a pellet or a batarang or something.
Yeah, he seemed like he always reached at the same spot in his utility belt. And it was always
it's always right
on the side. It was that's where we go.
Good old training.
But, I mean, think about this one. This one actually had a telephone in it in the 60s that was attached to police headquarters.
Now that was very different, you know.
And he could also access his Bat computer from inside the car.
Exactly. You know what? And you know what? That's the one thing you gotta love about these shows, because they inspired this kind of stuff. Yeah. I mean, nowadays we've got that. You know, we don't even. I mean, if this was made back in the 80s, we'd be like, yeah, 20 years ago they were saying we'd have phones in our car, and they'd be right. You know, nowadays we have phones in our pockets.
Yeah.
Not just phones, not like phones in our shoes like Maxwell Smart had.
Right.
You know, and yeah, the computers that can connect to anything. This was back before Wi-Fi or anything like that.
Yeah.
You know?
Like I said, 66 or mid-60s, I think, late 60s.
Exactly. So, and that brings us to another iconic vehicle, the Enterprise.
I think we're getting way out in space here now.
Exactly.
We've kept everything down close to Earth. I think
Mm-hmm.
now we're going up.
Let me tell you something. The best line in the movie Star Trek with Chris Pine and the other crews when they rebooted it was all of a sudden the bad guys had cornered Spock on his way in the middle of the galaxy. They were about to capture him, and this one guy yells, "Sir, another ship has entered our space coordinates, and here comes the Enterprise, guns blazing." You know, let me tell you something. I know that when Enterprise, The Search for Spock, right? Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock.
That's you're talking when he destroyed it.
When they destroyed it.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. The special effects crew, they weren't upset, okay? Because remember, it was still the 80s, so the Star Trek Enterprise was an actual tangible ship that they had to manipulate, right? And this ship was not very cooperative. So when they blew it up, they weren't crying very much. But when we saw it blowing up, we were blown away. We could not believe. I still remember to this day seeing a trailer that had the Enterprise coming at me in flames. And people were arguing about whether or not they had actually blown up the Enterprise. No one wanted to see that ship go, because this was the ship that carried us to the stars and everywhere we want. And
I think this version of the Enterprise that's on the screen here is probably my favorite, most iconic. You have the Next Generation. You have all those movies. This one from I think
the original series. Yeah, this is original series. Oh, we're all about the original here.
Right. This was definitely the most iconic of Enterprise. The other stuff is good, but this is by far my favorite of the Star Trek world.
One of the funny things is, it took me a long time to get used to the first Star Trek Enterprise from the Next Generation, because it would seem to like this one only flatter.
Yeah, I just didn't like the design as much. I like the thick. The thick dome on top of the circle.
Exactly. And you know what? This actually has somewhat of a sad story to it, too, the way they came about it. Because one of the things they were talking about with Gene Roddenberry was what the Starship Enterprise would look like, right? Gene Roddenberry was very much the creator of Star Trek. He liked him. He wanted to make sure that he had that title. Like, he wasn't just a writer. He wasn't just a producer. He was the creator.
Right.
That was a huge thing for him. And I was watching this show about, the making of Star Trek, how it came to be and all that. And they had special effects people work on it. Now, don't quote me on this. I can tell you one thing for sure. Do you remember the movie Argo? I know you haven't seen it yet.
No.
2012's best movie of the year in, Oscars and every other award. Here's the funny thing, okay? Argo is often seen as a CIA movie. That is not why Argo won. That is not why people liked Argo in Hollywood. They liked it because it was a Hollywood movie. Because Hollywood came to the rescue, right? The CIA was using Hollywood to create this happen. Now, John Goodman played a very legendary Hollywood special effects artist. He played the guy who gave Spock his ears.
Oh, really?
Yes, and he had worked with the CIA before on several different missions, okay? But the reason why I bring this up is because the special effects artists who really made Star Trek possible and believable and all that, if you ever saw some of the earlier designs, like what the Star Trek Enterprise should have looked like, Star Trek wouldn't have made it, okay? It wouldn't have happened at all, okay? This is why Star Trek made it, because this is a huge ship. It carries 200 plus people. It traverses the stars, and everyone loves the ship more than anything else. That's one problem I do have with the Chris Pine, the earlier version, this newer version.
Right.
It still doesn't have the feel or look of this Enterprise. There's something special about it. I guess it was our Enterprise.
Well, remember, ever see that episode of Next Generation where they have Scotty and he goes into the holodeck or whatever, and he wants to get on the bridge of the Enterprise, and he tells them which one. He's like, he gives the number, and he's like, no blooming A, B, C, or D. Just give me my plain old Enterprise.
Right, his own Enterprise.
Yeah, and it was like that was the Enterprise he loved, and it's the one we loved as
exactly
when we grew up with the. Well, we didn't grow up with the original trilogy so much because that was before our time.
Well,
but we saw it in reruns.
We're the ones who made it famous because we're the ones who watched it in syndication.
Right.
That's where it really became famous in syndication, and that brings us, of course, to the number one iconic ship. They're all memorable, but let's face it, you can't end this without talking about
the Millennium Falcon.
Exactly.
Based on a hamburger with an olive sitting next to it.
And a bite out of it.
Yeah.
For a cargo ship, I think it's just the way people talk about it and the fact that for a rusty, broken down... Because, everyone at one point in their lives has had a car like this.
Yes.
This thing is the best vehicle in the galaxy. It's the fastest.
Fastest ship in the galaxy.
And yet it is hanging by a thread. Right. But what a thread.
They spent most of Empire Strikes Back just fixing it up.
Exactly. One of the funny things is that at the beginning of Empire Strikes Back, Harrison Ford did not want to do the slap part. Where he turns it on, it shuts off, he hits it, it turns back on. And it's like, but you know what? That's what you loved about this and every other ship we've talked about, is that they had a personality all their own. They had a character,
Yeah, they had quirks. The thing a lot of people complain about is this an awfully weird design.
Yes.
For a ship having the cockpit on the side.
I always wondered about how they could really fly that thing because you can't really see.
Right. Well, then again, when you're up in space, you don't really have a lot of traffic,
That's true. But let's face it. Look what Han Solo was able to do. He was able to fly into an asteroid. Now, this is a big ship compared to 2 TIE fighters, but he was able to squeeze his ship through the crevice where these 2 TIE fighters ram into each other.
Right. They hit and bounce off and blow up.
They blow up. But that was an iconic scene. That was probably one of the best scenes ever in Star Wars.
Yeah.
And but you know what? It's how they talk about these ships, and it's the way they treat these ships. Like, everyone in Star Trek and Knight Rider and all the other things we talked about before, they were all loved.
Right.
They loved it, and they are very powerful in their own way. They had their own special, sense of accomplishment as compared to any other ship. I mean, don't get me wrong, Star Wars is full of great ships, X-Wings, TIE fighters.
The Star Destroyers.
The Star Destroyers. Yeah, exactly. But you know what? When people think Star Wars, they think Millennium Falcon.
Right. I mean, another ship I love, Slave One. Boba Fett ship.
Oh, the Boba Fett ship,
I love that one.
Exactly. And this one has... a lot of history. But this one has more history to it because you always hear about how Han got it.
Right, he won it from Lando, and it was Lando's ship. And then I remember I was reading one of the books. Remember Return of the Jedi when they go into the Death Star?
Okay,
they're flying down, they hit the thing.
Oh yes,
Bink, and Han reminds Lando of that last time in one of the books. Hey, I used the ship when it was yours, and when I returned it, it still had the satellite dish on.
Yeah, that thing was satellite dish. But yeah, I mean, if there's ever been an older ship, now one of the things that Harrison Ford talks about is the science behind this ship, which is something you don't really hear about, but you see it every time. When you look in the cockpit, it's surrounded by instruments, and this is the true heart, or brain, I should say, of the Millennium Falcon. It's all those instruments. The reason why it's so fast is really not because of just pure speed, but because the Millennium Falcon has all these navigational instruments so that it will go from point A to point B in the straightest line possible.
Right.
We all know that the fastest way to get to somebody is in a straight line.
Fastest or shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line.
Exactly, and that's what this can find better than any other ship in the galaxy, because I mean it's been modified for that. You know? Now, if there's anything I would like to read one day, it's the book Millennium Falcon. They finally wrote the complete history of this ship, and yeah, it's just like everything else, it's iconic.
Yes.
It's what we want to see. It's
Classic,
what we love.
Classic example of our childhood, right?
Yeah. Well, to be honest, in many ways, this is what I wanted to see when I went to see, episodes 1, 2, 3.
Right.
I kept looking for something that would show us a brand new Millennium Falcon. Because remember, episode 4, it's a used universe by this point.
Oh, yeah.
Everything has been like... And this had obviously been through the ringer.
Yeah.
More than once. And it's just a cargo ship, but I think Han himself had to put on the guns. Orlando did.
Someone had to modify it. I can't remember if it was Han or Orlando. But
right.
You're right. They modified it because it was meant just the ship cargo.
Yeah. And that actually is one of the funny things. You got to read the books of Star Wars because there are times when Han is like, I made some modifications myself, and then when Lando seems to get it back every once in a while, he gets a lot of professional engineers and mechanics who come into the ship. And they start ripping things out and start laughing at some of the quote-unquote improvement that Han has done. And it's funny because I remember when Han finally gets the ship back again, he's like, the ship feels smoother than it ever has. So it's like, Han's a great pilot, but he is no mechanic by any stretch of the imagination.
That's why he keeps Chewbacca with him.
Right.
Not for a bodyguard, he needs a mechanic.
Exactly. Another amazing story in itself. But that's our iconic machines of business.
Yeah.
And you know what? I miss those. I miss when movies come out. They don't make ships like they used. They don't make machines like they used to.
They have ships and stuff in the movies,
right?
But nobody really pays attention to them. They focus more on the characters.
The characters, yeah.
It's like, they have the opportunity, but I feel that a lot of times they just drop the ball.
They do. And one of the reasons is because they don't show the love to the machines that the characters in the movies did,
Right.
Scotty, Kirk. I mean, even remember one time Kirk had this tear or was touched by this woman who, if she cried on you or touched you, you would fall madly in love with her. But the one thing that Kirk was able to do to beat her was that he loved the Enterprise more than anything else. And they made that a point. Han loved the Millennium Falcon.
Well, the Dukes of Hazzard considered generally family.
Yes, exactly.
Boss Hogg would always try to take it. No, you're not taking the car. It's our family member.
Exactly. And, people don't give that kind of reverence to machines nowadays.
Right.
I think it's because, you know what? Back in those days, those things were so incredibly special. It was very rare to have a machine like that. And they demonstrated that. So some tips for Hollywood there. Love your machines and make them special again,
Absolutely.
Because that's the way we kind of grew up. When we grew up, people loved their cars and they would never drive any other car.
Right.
And we've kind of lost that in this day and age. But hey, I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. We hope, and you know what? If you have any other suggestions, please comment on any other vehicles we might have missed.
Yes, we'd like to hear from you.
Yeah, we'd like to hear from you. We were thinking of doing G.I. Joe, but
like every vehicle, they're all the Hiss Tank, the Rattler, the Dragonfly.
There was too many to choose from. We could probably do a whole podcast just on G.I. Joe itself.
Oh, there you go. Stay tuned. G.I. Joe podcast.
Yeah, just on their vehicles and what was special about it. Well, thanks a lot, guys. We appreciate you. Like us on Facebook, Pozzible Movie Reviews, or Pozzible Movie Critics also. And find me on Twitter. Find Joe on Twitter at
Jedi Knight 52.
Yep, we'll see you later, guys. Take it easy.
Right.